coming. Here he is.
Hello, everybody. How are we doing?
Hello.
Great.
Hi.
Rabbi, I want to introduce you to my friend Leanne. She's up in the corner making challah.
All right.
Hi. Hi.
Leanne.
And my friend Netta who's in the corner just sitting there.
All right.
Thank you.
First of all, Leanne, are you making challah for enough for the entire class?
I actually am.
I'll take 2 loaves.
Actually, how big is the class?
Well, if everybody heard you make challah, it would be double the size.
Yeah.
But she's a professional bread maker. We're serious
Oh,
here.
come on.
Okay,
Oh,
then
come
triple the
on.
size. All right, very good, very good. Welcome, welcome. All right. So let's jump in. So this week's parsha picks up where the last Torah portion left off, not simply just because, as we know, all Torah portions to a certain degree carry on where the last one left off. And that, by the way, is not necessarily chronologically, because we know the Torah does not feel the need to follow a chronological order. Chronological order means that the order of events in a timeline, that this thing happened before this, etc., etc. The reason is because the Torah is not a history book or a story book, and therefore the most important process is not the process of time where we want to report an event in chronological order, but the Torah is an instruction manual, and so primarily what follows what, or why do we choose what gets said when, is more about the theme. If this theme is connected to that theme, then we will have it follow. Or if this idea is important to say right now, that's the primary thing, and that is why we have a famous statement in the Talmud that is oft repeated by Rashi in his commentary. Why this particular episode or this particular message is coming at this point in time. He warns us, he admonishes us, Ein mukdam u'machar b'Torah. They're right. There is no earlier or later in the Torah. The Torah doesn't divide itself chronologically or pace itself chronologically. So sometimes, like we had in last week's Torah portion, we introduce Yitro, Moshe's father-in-law, who at one point or another was not only a practitioner, but was a cleric of pretty much every pagan worship that existed out there. And then he finally, Vayishma Yitro heard, and he came running. And we get introduced to Yitro, and then Yitro sees Moshe teaching Torah to people waiting online to get Moshe's judgment on a particular case or a particular matter. And Yitro comes and he gives the advice, and he says, Moshe, don't do this alone, rather create a hierarchy of judges and instructors, judges over 10 people, over 100, over 1,000, etc., and only the really difficult matters will come to you. And then the Torah tells us the story of the 10 Commandments. Well, that's out of chronological order, because what do you think it was that the people were coming to Moshe for clarity on? Was on the Torah, which only was given later in the Torah portion. So rather we see that the parsha paces itself not chronologically, but thematically, because we introduce Yitro at the beginning of this Torah portion.
So are you saying that God didn't put this in order, but mankind put it in order?
No, God put it in order, but he put it not in chronological order, but thematic order.
So humans haven't come in and changed anything. It's the way it was supposed to be. Okay.
Yes. And Rashi, citing the Talmud, is explaining what is the order. It's not that the Torah is out of order. The Torah is in a thematic order rather than in a chronological order. So we introduced Yitro at the beginning of last week's Torah portion. So then we're saying, okay, while we're on the subject of Yitro, let's get to know him a little bit and tell a story about him. And then we go to the next chronological event, which was the giving of the 10 Commandments. All this to come back to the point I was saying originally, that when we say that this parsha follows on last week's Torah portion, we mean primarily thematically, but also chronologically, in the sense that now that the Torah was given, we understand that it's not just the 10 Commandments. And that is actually hinted to in the very first letter of this week's Torah portion. The very first letter, not even the very first word, but the very first letter. The Torah portion begins, Ve'ela hamishpatim asher tasim lifnehem. And these are the statutes, these are the laws that you shall place before them. And the commentaries immediately, being that every word in the Torah is exact, every letter in the Torah is exact. In fact, every calligraphic crown on top of the letters are exact, right? Rabbi Akiva was able to learn tremendous amount of information just from the crowns, the calligraphic embellishments on top of the letters. He learned entire ideas. So everything in Torah is entirely exact. So the fact that the parsha begins with the word begins ve'ele rather than ele hamishpatim, and these are the commands that you, or these are the laws you shall put before them, but rather begins with the word and, links it obviously with what we said earlier, right? The word and is a conjunction, right? And every elementary school English teacher, grammar teacher told you that what? You do not
Never
begin a sentence with
Let's start a sentence with and.
You're not allowed to begin a sentence with and. And not only you're not allowed to begin a sentence with and, or rather, even more than not beginning a sentence, you're definitely not allowed to begin a paragraph, right? And you are for sure not allowed to begin an entire book, right?
Do we still have grammar rules?
Yeah. Yes. Well, unfortunately,
Well said,
right.
Jerry.
Exactly. That
Says an old
that
English
point-
teacher.
That point will become obsolete in a couple of years. So it was like, oh, what do you mean? Of course you can begin any sentence with that. I begin all my texts with and. In fact, if I even write out a full word without abbreviating or misspelling it on purpose, I should begin a medal, because unfortunately all standards have just gone straight out the window. But
Yep.
Yeah, Sudi, you it's the new world. I know Sudi always is in my case, and I'm sure others, is the grammar police. She makes sure that it's written correctly and with proper
I'm
punctuation.
glad she's doing it so I don't have to.
Right, but
He's my editor.
so
She's good.
so here we begin not only a sentence, not only a paragraph, but the entire story of this week's parsha. The entire book of this week's parsha begins with the word and. Now here's the dirty little secret. Many Torah portions begin with the word and. Vayikra, well, vayetze, vayishlach, vayeshev, all the va, all it means and. And it's almost become a point, right? That if you want to pretend like you're saying something, like you're quoting a
But
biblical passage.
Rabbi,
Yes.
quick question. When you say Vayelech, the Vav in Hebrew is not exactly all the time and. It's depend where it is, because it is like a command. Or I mean, it's a verb. Vayelech. So he is going to, I mean, he is walking. But when you put ve'asa, so it is different. The Vav, if you know, in its translation, it's not necessary like and.
So the answer is it actually is and, but because, and that's exactly the point I'm about to make, it's so pervasive in Hebrew that it becomes, at least in biblical Hebrew, because we don't see that we use it in modern Hebrew, and that's exactly the point, that it's so typical to begin like that in fact, if anybody wants to almost pretend like they're quoting from scripture, if they're really, and he then said, right? You begin with the and. The and almost makes it biblical because it's so common, it's so out of place in regular speech, and so common in biblical speech. And he went, all right? And God looked down, right? If you're going to make any statement about God, you got to begin with the word and, right? And God peered down from heaven. It's just so typical of an intro that it's almost almost the character of a biblical verse, is that it begins with the word and. But
So if I say Vayomar, so it's mean and he said.
right. And the
Okay.
reason why the Torah does that is in fact to link it, to connect it with what came before. And each one of those is has its own reason. But this one in particular caught the eye of the commentaries. This ve'ela hamishpatim, because usually, and I'm not sure who spoke. I guess it was Netta, right? You were the one who was.
Yes.
So usually, it is in the context that you bring it, that you said it, which is vayelech, vayomar, which we're telling a story, right?
Yeah.
And the vav is kind of saying we're not beginning at the very beginning of a story. Whenever we're talking, we're picking up in the middle, and that's the vav is kind of saying we're picking up in the middle, right? Vayomer Hashem. This is not the first moment that Avraham existed, right? He lived for 70 years before this. So the vav kind of says that there's a whole story that comes before it, but it's either not important or we're connecting it to the story. But this is one of the first times that we are not telling a story, but we're making a statement. And we begin the statement with, and these are the commandments that you shall place before them. Right? Now that is a little bit different. That's a little bit more unique. This is not a story where we're picking up and we're saying like the flow of an event, right?
Well, it's not a verb before a verb.
Right. It's a vav before a statement. It's not a vav before an event.
Right.
That's what we're saying, or an action that somebody took, right? We are talking about a vav that begins a statement, and that is uncommon. For example, if the Ten Commandments began with Ve'anochi Hashem Elokecha Asher Hotzeiticha, that would be strange, right? Or
Right.
Yishma Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, because those are statements, and statements are definitive. Right? And yet this statement is ve'ela hamishpatim. And so the rabbis say this is a strange one. This and is not a flow from a continued story. This is a statement, and yet this statement is linking to something earlier. And these. This vav is telling us something unique. What is this vav telling us? And
That was good. 603 is better.
Yes, but more comprehensive. Ve'ela mishpatim, says Rashi quoting the Talmud, ma elu misinai af elu misinai.
Yeah.
And these also were said at Sinai. Don't think that God just gave the 10 Commandments at Sinai. And these as well. In other words, that's the continuity. It's a thematic continuity or even a chronological continuity. But what we're saying is, don't think that at the end of Parshat Yitro, that everything, all the information there was what God said at Mount Sinai. Rather, ve'ele, and from here, and everything, every other law that will be said, the vav that is connecting Parshat Yitro to this parsha is actually connecting it to all subsequent parshas, telling you that every law that we will define from here on after, all of these are connected back to the moment of Sinai. Ma elu mi Sinai, af elu mi Sinai. That's what the vav is telling us. So that is why it is important that this statement does not begin, these are, but rather, and these are, and these as well, these commands as well from Sinai are that we are enumerating. And then the Torah says, what? What about these laws? Asher tasim lifnehem. You shall place before them. Tasim lifnehem. You shall place before them. Very interesting turn of phrase. Not the most basic and not the most the simplest way to say. You generally, well, if you had a general that say, all right, soldiers, here is the commands that I shall place before you. I say, okay, clearly this general's got a dramatic flair or delusions of grandeur. These are the commands that you shall place before. This is a weird way of saying it. we are so familiar with this language because we get to this Torah portion every week, and that's the opening statement. I mean, every year, and the opening statement. But if you think about it, it is a very strange way. These are the commands that I command you, or these are the commands that you shall do. Right? Also, who is he talking to? Who is God talking to? And these are the commands that you shall place before them. Well,
Moshe.
we are assuming are the Jewish people, right? Fine. But you, Asher Tasim, so Jerry says, Moshe, the God is talking to Moshe, and he's saying, Moshe, these are the commands that you shall put before them. Okay? Again, if that's the case, if God is telling to Moshe, then we already have kind of that introductory statement that God usually uses whenever he tells Moshe to relay a command to the people, which is
Vayomer Hashem Moshe.
Lemor.
Toma. What does he say?
Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe Lemor.
Lemor. Yeah.
Ela Mishpatim Lemor. These are the commands that you shall say to them.
So why are we putting them in front of?
So what does
Instead of
this
just-
mean? What is
Right.
this vernacular teaching us?
Good.
And ladies and gentlemen, or in this case, all ladies, what is packed into those words is nothing short of the entirety of the Jewish library that we have today.
What does that mean?
What does
You're not taking the JLI class, so you don't know.
very good. Yes. Jerry knows where I'm going with this. Okay. If I asked you to define the parameters of Torah, if I say define Torah, how would you respond to that? Jerry?
Naaseh v'nishma. I would say naaseh v'nishma.
All right. Okay. Fair. That's but what I'm asking you is, if somebody says, "What is Torah?" So Naaseh v'nishma is in a way a correct answer, but I don't mean to say. I mean to really in a concrete way. If somebody says,
Way to rule your life.
Torah is
Rather-
Torah.
let me put it to you this way. Again, we're answering philosophically, concretely. What is and what is not Torah? Is Shakespeare Torah?
No.
No,
Is the book
But
of
it-
Joshua Torah?
Is what?
The book of Joshua Torah?
Sure.
no,
I
Why?
think it is.
no. Because
Okay.
it's not instruction.
I see what she's
No,
doing.
but
Because it's-
I'm
Well,
but
I said
I'm-
Hora'ah.
but I'm being more, what's it called? Again, that's you get it philosophically. If I if I go into a library, what do I expect to see under the Torah section? What is if somebody is again not I'm not asking the question kind of on a deeper level that I would be asking to students like you. All of you are kind of educated, Jewishly educated people. So when I ask you what Torah is, you're reaching for a more philosophical. I'm asking on a very basic level.
I will look for self-help books. If I put the Torah, I put it wherever it's self-help books.
Okay, good. You're still getting philosophical. I'm
Rules
about the
for
basic-
living,
Maybe
rules
most
for living
people
your
say-
life.
Most people say it's the 5 books of Moses.
Okay, good. So 5 books of
No,
Moses.
it's not. It's more than that.
Okay, good.
I know, but that's what he's looking for, like
no.
a basic
I'm saying
answer.
that's my point. Get to the very basic. What do I see?
The basic answer is
A
the 5 books of Moses.
blueprint.
No,
of
again,
living life.
it's still philosophical, not philosophical. Don't answer to me in philosophical terms. I'm talking about concrete
Jewish
books.
laws of living?
Uh,
Jewish laws of living?
Still,
What
Diane,
books?
you're giving me. I'm talking about which books are considered Torah.
The 5 books of
Torah,
Moses.
Talmud,
Dvarim,
commentary,
dvarim.
Rishonim, Achronim. There's a
Okay,
lot.
good.
Bereshit,
This is where I wanted
Vayikra.
to. This is where I want the conversation.
Dvarim and Bamidbar. Dvarim and Bamidbar.
Only those two?
I think because that's where the instruction, no? Where is the
The
instruction?
Reshit is not a part of Torah.
It's part of the Torah, but it's a
That's it.
preparation.
Again, don't, not that you're getting too advanced in the conversation. I'm asking very basically, if some fellow named Joe McDonald showed up and said, what is Torah? And you're not ready to get all philosophical with them. They're not there yet.
Okay, so 5
What-
books of Moses.
Good. 5 books of Moses. Anything else can be under that, in that category. The book
Sure.
of Joshua is the book of Joshua. Could you,
Tanakh.
if you put the book of Joshua into the Torah section of the library, are you misplacing that book? Or are you placing?
No.
No, it does belong there. Okay, the book of Joshua. What about Maimonides' Mishnah Torah?
Yes.
It
That's
also belongs in there.
It is.
Right.
What about a book written, a modern day book, Laws of Cooking on Shabbat?
yes,
Mm.
yes,
Okay,
yes.
so wait a minute. This is the problem. Torah it's God's Torah, right?
Yes.
At best, you can make an argument that God was involved in 24 volumes. Really, God's only involved in 5, right? 5, the Chamishei Chumshei Torah, right? We call those the Torah.
Yeah.
And in Tanakh, those 5 are the ones that get the title Torah, and Nevi'im and Ketuvim are not called Torah. That's why Tanakh, right?
Right.
So wait a minute. So on the one hand, you say that only the 5 books, those are the word of God. That's why it's called Torah. And the books of the prophets are Nevi'im. They're not Torah, that's Nevi'im. And the Tehillim and Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs and all those are the Ketuvim. They're not either Torah. And yet on the other hand, I say a book by some rabbi today in which he's discussing whether you're allowed to set a Shabbat mode on your GE electric oven. If he writes a whole thing about that, we'd also call that Torah. So what exactly is the parameters of Torah? And what I'm trying to hint at is a very important idea. Torah is not a one-sided enterprise,
Bingo.
which is that it's the word of God and that's it.
So,
Torah was always meant to be a partnership between God and mankind, with the written Torah and the oral Torah, Torah shebiktav and Torah sheba'al peh. What I mean to say is that God doesn't limit Torah to his words, his spoken words or his written words, which are the 5 books. He doesn't either limit his Torah to his words given over and recorded by the prophets, right? Which is, and not only that, he doesn't limit his Torah to words written by human beings, but with clear divine inspiration, like the words of Tehillim or the words of Shir HaShirim, because that's what makes it into Tanakh. 24 volumes that are written with God's direct involvement. Either he himself wrote them, which is the words of the Torah, the 5 books. He dictated them, or they were through his revelation, which is the book, the words of the Nevi'im, the prophets, or he inspired them, which are the works of the Tehillim, whatever, which were written with divine inspiration, written by a human being, but with divine inspiration. And it was actually the job of the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, the men of the Great Assembly, 120 people, which were like the governing body in the day that in the time when Ezra HaSofer brought the Jewish people back and rebuilt the second Beit HaMikdash and began the second commonwealth of the Jewish people in the Holy Land. There wasn't kings at that point. There was no more kings. There was no Davidic line. What you had was a governing body of 120 great sages called the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, the men of the Great Assembly. Anybody want to know what the echoes of that are in modern times?
well, I think that all the rabbis who not train but are in school, you're always nothing's ever straight. I mean, everything can be spoken about and fixed, and you're always looking to change or not change, or why we do this or why we do that, because you're bringing your knowledge. And when I say your, I mean, you are a rabbi, so I'm using you as not, certainly not me, but everybody who knows the laws and have studied them can contribute.
Yes, Diane, you're getting to the point that we're reaching for. So hold that thought. But I'm saying, so you had the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. On the Anshe Knesset, anybody know what is where the echoes of that great body governmental body from
The
the days of the
Knesset.
second, the modern
what
day
we do?
Knesset. The modern day Knesset is called the Knesset because it's modeled after that Knesset of Ezra HaSofer. In fact, so much so that the size of that Knesset back in the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, the men of the Great Assembly, how many members were there in the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah?
120, I think.
120. Guess how many are in the modern Senate? In the modern Knesset?
120.
120. So now I don't know if they emulate the great Knesset in any other way than that, but
Probably not.
I'm not going to go there.
Some
I'm not going to get all political here. But the bottom line is that the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, one of their tasks was deciding which books, which great works, make it into the Tanakh, into the Bible, and which don't. So includes, and they obviously the 5 books, that's obvious, they go in. Now, but at the same time that many of the other books of the prophets that are included, there was other works at that time that they did not include, that they said were not written with divine inspiration, therefore do not pass the litmus test to be included in the Bible, because to be included in the Bible, you needed to have, God had to be involved. God had to be involved. It had to be Nevuah or Ruach HaKodesh, or divine inspiration. And if they determined the book was written, and now who are they to determine? Well, many of the men of that Anshe Knesset HaGedolah themselves were Nevi'im, were prophets. So they knew how to measure whether the book was written with prophecy or was just a brilliant work of a devout Jew, which is great, but it's not part of the Tanakh. And for example, the book of the Maccabees is not part of Tanakh, even though it was written before many of the other books that were included. And other great works, the work of Enoch, right?
Right, Enoch.
Is not included in Tanakh. It's in what they call the Apocrypha, other works and that around that time. So if you would say, okay, so to be called Torah, it needs to be with God's divine involvement. It can't be the enterprise of a human being, because then it's not Torah. That would be wrong.
So what you are saying is the Torah is only 5 books of Moses, because
no,
the rest.
No, he's not saying that.
No, I'm saying, so somebody could assume that what gets the title Torah is either the 5 books or anything that has divine involvement, with Hashem was involved, which is all those 24 books, but anything which is entirely the work of a human being's thinking and thought process, even a great Talmid Chacham, but that can't be called Torah, right? Because the 24 volumes are the Torah. That's the Torah. Either you have the 5 books, which are really the title Chamisha Chumshei Torah, but altogether 24 volumes are called Torah Shebiktav, and that could be called Torah. Anything else that a human being writes is not considered Torah. One could assume that, but that would be incorrect. That would be incorrect.
But you're only studying it. So
What?
it's not a stable, not that I want to say stable, but it's not in cement, I would say, because you're always, and when I say you're always, it's rabbis and those people are discussing it and what it means and what interpretation it is.
Right, but maybe we don't have discuss away, but maybe just like the book of Maccabees talks and has ideas and philosophies, but we don't include it in the Bible, so the rabbis can discuss whatever it is, but maybe we don't call that Torah. Maybe we call that conversation.
Right. I have to say that one of the major differences between conservative Judaism and Chabad, which is not conservative, is that they tell us that what's it called? Midrash goes on and on, that it never stops, that there was never a time when it was cut off.
Right, no,
I've
but
mentioned that to you before.
right, but that I think again.
So maybe
that's-
Diane is reflecting that.
No. I think Diane's coming to say something. Come in a minute to make this point, but more to the question: what gives us the right to say that rabbinic discussion on a particular matter? Yes, sure, it's a discussion on a Torah matter, but what gives you the right to say that human beings' discussion on a rabbinic matter that has no divine inspiration? How dare you call that Torah?
No.
How dare you call that Torah? That's your conversations on Torah, but it's not Torah.
But aren't some of the ideas that we now have based on Torah?
As I said, conversations on Torah, but they can't be called Torah. They're conversations on the subject of Torah.
So if people do that, like they have this cord that can go around a community so that people with baby carriages can go.
The Eruv.
The error.
Right. So somebody came along and did that after all of this other stuff was already printed and everything. So who is made it available to be able to do that? That's what I'm asking.
So first of all, I'm asking more basic than that.
Well,
Because you're talking about where they get the authority, but I'm saying, can you call that Torah? Or is Torah reserved just for what God said? Or
But if
God
God
is-
said something different and now you're making it so that.
okay, I'm saying you're a different one. That's I don't want that. That's a fair question and conversation, but it's slightly different than what I'm asking. I'm asking what happens if it's not about your seemingly saying something different than God. You're discussing but it's not God inspired, right? We said that you can't call it the Bible. If I sit there and write a book, can I add it to the Bible?
No, the Bible is sealed. But if I
Not
understand
the
you,
Jewish Bible.
yeah, but you
And that's part of our history, that we are like that.
But so this is what I'm talking about. I get it. We're doing forensic analysis on this. How did we get here? One might assume that that the concept of Torah, that the word Torah does indicate that it's the word of God, and anything that, as we said, what makes it into the Bible? Only words that God Himself spoke, that God dictated in prophecy, or that God inspired in the works of like King David's Psalms or whatever it is, which was written with divine inspiration. But if I sit there and I write some great expose on a Torah thought, then it's an expose on Torah, but it can't be called Torah. What I wrote, my work, my enterprise, my contribution is outside of the bounds of Torah. It's a conversation on Torah, right?
but the way you put it, but the way I understand the way you put it, so whatever stem from the Torah, you basically connect it to that. You explain that if it stems from the Torah, it is related. Is it translated? Is it, it may be explaining, for example, writing about the kosher, explaining how to, to cook a kosher meal. It's stem from the Torah. So because that, can we call it a Torah? Because it's stem from there? I don't know.
If I give a whole long conversation and a great and a brilliant and correct explanation on the Constitution, can I call it the Constitution? My
Interpretation.
my what's it called? My speech, my lecture. Can I say my lecture is now part of the Constitution? No.
Can I answer as the only lawyer in the room, I think?
Go ahead, Jerry.
No.
No. It's a lecture on the Constitution, but it's not the Constitution. So I can give a lecture on Torah, but it's not necessarily, one might assume that it's not necessarily Torah. But that would be incorrect thinking.
Okay. Yeah. I knew you were
Why?
setting us up.
Why? Because of that verse that's in the beginning of our parsha, immediately after the giving of the Torah, Ve'ela HaMishpatim, and these are the laws, says God, that Asher Tasim Lifnehem, Moshe, as the Torah teacher, I am not only empowering you, but I am making it your responsibility to not just give it to them, but place it before them, which means that I am making it your job, Moshe Rabbeinu, to get involved and contribute to this thing we call Torah. That not only do we have the written Torah, which is the word of God in the 24 volumes that we call the Bible, but then there's the second half of Torah, not the second half of conversations on Torah, but the second half of Torah itself, which is the human involvement in which you will clarify and explain and unpack and place before the people. In other words, what God is saying is my words in the 5 books and in the other 19 volumes that make up the Tanakh are like the raw ingredients. And Moshe, what I am telling you as the first of the rabbis, and anybody else who wants to become a rabbi, and Diane, this is to your point, anybody who, you have a responsibility to contribute to this process by taking the raw ingredients, the raw information, and creating the ready-to-eat dishes out of them.
Yeah, but what do you do? What do you do about the slippery slope?
Of course it's a slippery slope, but one second. But
All
first,
right.
before we get to that, let's first make sure we have this idea firmly understood.
Good.
Torah is not just the 24 volumes of the Tanakh. Every great rabbi, from the days of the Talmud to the days of Rashi to modern day, that are taking the raw material of Torah and then applying it and defining it and placing it before the people ready to eat. They are all part of that Torah Sinai process.
So that could be everything in life, because if I'm reading a book, How to Raise Children, it's also, I am a part of the Torah. I am commanded to raise the children in a certain way, and in the Mishnah. So everything that you pick up could be part of the Torah.
Absolutely. But that's in fact where the responsibility comes in. That is the great responsibility. And this gets back to your point, Paula, which is that in this is not a gift. This is not a license. This is a responsibility.
You say more a roadmap?
What? No, what I mean is, hear what I mean. This is a responsibility. In other words, I don't get to sit there and come up with whatever idea I want and say, yeah, this is Torah. The opposite. My whole approach is I start with the raw ingredients from God. I don't deviate one iota. All I am doing is developing God's idea. It can't be, the idea cannot originate with me. The idea originates from God. All I'm doing it is unpacking it further and further in today's modern times and whatever it is, but entirely the ultimate and incredible and entirely defined rules here are, it needs to be sourced all the way back. Whatever you are going to bring forward, it cannot be innovation. It has to be development. It cannot be innovation. Ma elu misinai, af elu misinai. Just as the 10 Commandments were God's word at Mount Sinai, so too when a rabbi talks about electric Shabbos modes on your oven, it has to go all the way back to Sinai in an unbroken chain.
Yeah, you need proof text for everything.
Exactly. Everything needs to be sourced.
But we're not in the same time zone that God came down and gave that to Moses. So I thought that maybe the reason that he wants a partner is because as things change, the partners can but see it from a different angle than God saw it at that time.
Nope, absolutely, positively, 150% not. Let me explain.
Rabbi, what about that?
One second. Why? because this is the difference when people say that the Torah is a classic text. That is entirely incorrect. The Torah is not a classic text. The Torah is an eternal text. Torah hi nitzchit. There's a very big difference between a classic and something that's eternal. A classic means that it was written in a particular time in a particular era and was relevant to then, and it manages to still maintain some relevance, even the same amount of relevance. No, not at all. Tom Sawyer is considered a classic. It was far more relevant and was far more adaptable in its time. Now it still carries some. Eternal means it is utterly beyond time, which means as relevant as it was 3,000 years ago is as relevant as it is today, is as relevant as it will be in 3,000 years. So Diane, no, our role is not to update the Torah. The Torah doesn't need updating. It's eternal. It is as current and as relevant today. What it does need is it needs to be developed. What God always knew was true, what God knows is true and is true, we need to find the language, right? God was speaking in Hebrew, we need to translate it into English, because that's the language that's spoken today. But does that change the principles of the Torah? No. When God says you shall rest on Shabbat, then we don't change that. We just say today, and here's just a mental metaphor that we can have. We are not plugging Torah into our lives, into modern lives. We are plugging our modern lives into Torah. The Torah stays put. It always is and always will be. But God obviously understands that while the Torah is eternal, we are not. And so we don't have an eternal universal language. Back people spoke Hebrew, they speak Aramaic, they speak English. Now, obviously, we're preserving Hebrew, and also things don't stay eternal in our world. People were using fire. Now we use electricity. Maybe, right? Now we still lose a little fire. Maybe we'll go back to electricity. Maybe people use synthetics. Maybe we'll go back to raw material. Maybe we'll go away from raw material and go entirely into synthetic. Things change in our world. Torah doesn't change. But at any era, you need the rabbis who will plug current circumstance back into the eternal Torah and say, what does the Torah tell us about this particular circumstance that has changed from the time from 100 years ago? That is the unique balance, the unique partnership in which God says, because the other way is, here is the words of God, like think about the Amish, right? The Amish, there is no updating of the Amish doctrine, but you know what else there isn't? There also isn't, there's no development of the doctrine. Torah is eternal. We don't have to do it exactly like our forefathers did with the robes and the whatever it is. The Torah can look modern because the Torah is modern just as much as it is ancient. The Torah is eternal. The principles will never change. So even as we are nowadays engaged in Shabbos and we're wearing suits and dresses and what have you, and we're doing things very different. We're not bringing animals onto the altar in the temple, but the principles of Torah have not changed. In other words, if Moshe Rabbeinu walked through a wormhole and ended up in modern day Israel, he would say, yeah, you're doing this entirely correct.
Rabbi, I think
At least that's what we aspire.
what would you do if anybody else but Rabbeinu Gershom made his takanot?
So that's the point. How did he have the right to do so? From the Torah itself. Because the Torah says that one of the jobs of the rabbi is to protect the Torah, to put fences around the Torah. It's in the Torah.
Sure.
So there is the concept of injunctions, and that's what Rabbeinu Gershom is not saying that anywhere in the Torah it says that you may not marry more than one wife, but he says that the Torah does say that in protecting other unbending principles of Torah, we need to create boundaries. For example, am I allowed to touch a pen on Shabbat?
You can touch it, you just can't move it.
No, you're not
You're
even allowed
allowed,
to.
but it's a
You're not even allowed
fence.
to touch it?
You
Correct.
want to put a fence.
But that all that is as a rabbinical fence. The
It
rabbi
might
never
lead to
said-
dancing. Yeah.
Say what?
It might lead to dancing. It's an old joke.
Yes, right. But the point is, the rabbis are entirely remaining loyal to the principles of Torah.
But
And
wait, I have a question about that. So what one rabbi says, you know what? In the Torah, one rabbi said, no, you're allowed to marry 4 women, up to 4 women. One rabbi says, no, I'm allowed to marry 1 woman. So what do you do? All of them come from the Torah, both of them saying, this said this said this.
So you have a difference. Now the example is not perfect, because none of them are saying in the Torah it says you're not allowed to marry more than 1 woman, because in the Torah it does say there's no indication in the Torah that you're not allowed to marry more than 1 woman. That is strictly what's called a rabbinical injunction as a siyag. Rabbeinu Gershom saw a necessity to create this kind of boundary, but he never claimed that this was directly in the Torah. Only that the responsibility to create such boundaries is in the Torah. Having said that, but Netta, you are correct that you'll have a Hillel that says the Torah says, when the Torah says this and this and this, it means that you have to do it in this way. And you have a Shammai that says when the Torah says this and this and this, you got to do it that way, right? So you'll have differences of opinion all over. That's what the Talmud is. The Talmud is constantly engaged in differences of opinion because we know that we are not going to be perfect. We're not going to understand God all the time perfectly, but we're going to try our best. So Hillel tries his best, and this is the way he understands it, and Shammai tries his best, and this is the way he understands it. So how do we do it? So the Torah has a process for that, and in the Torah it says that when there's a different opinion, acharei rabim lahatot, you shall go after the majority. The Torah itself provides for this because the Torah understands that in this partnership that the Torah has created between God, who is perfect, and human beings that are not perfect, that we're going to have to figure it out. And so God gives us the rules on how we have to figure it out. Now, what happens? This is a fascinating moment where God himself breaks those rules. He says you should go after the majority, right? That when you're deliberating over something that's not clearly spelled out in Torah and you're trying to figure it out, and you have 2 opinions. You have and one opinion has the majority, and one opinion is the minority opinion. Then the halacha has to follow the majority opinion until irrevocable proof is brought that says that tells us differently. That the proof tells us that in our minds we understand. Okay, that's proof. So what's the case? The case is about the famous achnai oven, right? Right. We know that things that are in their natural state cannot become tamei. They cannot become impure. But if I take a mound of rocks, right, and I just hollow out a hole in the mound of rocks, a natural mound of rocks, and I hollow out a hole, and I make an oven out of it, right? I light a fire inside that hole. That's considered natural, and it cannot become tamei. On the other hand, if I take a whole bunch of rocks and I build an oven, that's no longer natural, and that can become tamei. What happens if it's somewhere in the middle, where I take kind of a natural mound, but I reinforce it, and I add some structure to it and stability? So and the first one who came up with that oven was called Achnai. That was his name.
Yeah, okay.
So this became a massive debate between Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Eliezer. One says that it's too much man-made and it can now become impure, and the other one says no, it's still natural enough and it does not become impure. Back and forth they're arguing. The majority sees it like the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua. And so the ruling is about to come down like Rabbi Yeshua. And Rabbi Eliezer says, I know I'm right. I'm so right. I know I'm so right that I'm going to make a ness. I'm going to make a miracle that will prove that from with divine evidence that I'm right. It says that this tree that has not been growing any fruit will all of a sudden start to blossom. And sure enough, it starts to blossom. To which Rabbi Yeshua says, not
Don't
impressed.
learn.
Not impressed.
Halacha is not from
What is
the
it? It
third
says
grade.
this river that was flowing this way is going to flow the other way, and it flows the other way. And Rabbi Yeshua says, not impressed. Rabbi Elazar says the walls of this very Beit Medrash will start collapsing in on themselves to prove that I am right. And the walls start to collapse in, and Rabbi Yeshua says, hey, troublemaker, stop destroying the Beit Medrash.
The halacha
And then
is
finally,
not determined by the
one
walls.
second, a voice comes down from heaven
Uh,
and says, the halacha is like Rabbi Eliezer.
Lo b'shamayim.
To which Rabbi Yeshua says, God, that's not the rules you set up. You set up the rules that it goes after the majority. The majority sees it like me. Now, if you want to come and make an argument that will sway our opinion, by all means. If you want to come and tell us why in our logic we should see it differently, then go ahead. But up until you do that, you can't just come in and assert, because that's not the rules of the game that you yourself have made, God. You understood the necessity that if the Torah was going to be preserved for all generations, then it was going to be the responsibility of the scholars of every generation to commit to teaching and preserving, understanding, and teaching the points. That's the way you set it up. And God, we're playing only by your rules, but by your rules, you can't just come in and say that. You have to convince us differently. And when God says, nitzchuni, my son,
You're right.
you win.
The whole time you were talking, I was thinking about that passage, and that it's so important.
And it all is based on what we have in the very first verse of this parasha. Ve'ela Mishpatim, Moshe, I'm going to give you a platter of laws, right? But asher tasim lifneihem, but I'm going to make it your responsibility to place it before them. And how does the Talmud explain this? The Talmud continues that metaphor. Place it before them like a set table ready for the feast. Ki, how do you say that in Hebrew? Ki shulchan aruch.
Oh,
Shulchan l'seuda. Now you know why when the great Rabbi Yosef Cairo undertook this responsibility of taking the laws as they are in the raw material as in the Torah and placing it into halachot, to specific laws about what we do. He decided to call that great effort of his
Shulchan Aruch.
the Shulchan Aruch, because he's fulfilling this statement of this parsha, that it is the rabbi's job to take the raw material that God provides in his instruction manual and to spell it out, right? If God gives you, can a teacher walk into a classroom and say,
Yes,
here's the textbook, read it, the test is on Tuesday?
fair.
Many have.
If they do that, they're a horrible teacher and they are not fulfilling their responsibility. The Torah is the textbook, but it takes the rabbis or any of the scholars, the teachers, to teach the material, to say this is what the textbook means when it says it, not to make up their own ideas, not to say, the textbook says this, but I'm giving you new ideas. God forbid, any rabbi who speaks like that is not a rabbi, is not a rabbi. Any rabbi who says the Torah is outdated, this is an old-fashioned textbook, etc., they are defying the very first principle that textbooks, human textbooks, of course, will be outdated because they're written by human beings. The Torah is written by God. Torah never becomes outdated. But it doesn't mean that the rabbis can plop down the textbook, the Torah, and say, read it, test is on Monday. Rather, here is the textbook. Now let's explore it together and understand it correctly. And God says from the very get-go right here, Ela Mishpatim asher tasim lifneihem. That is the responsibility of the rabbis. That's the responsibility. And who's the rabbis? They're not some shadowy cabal in some back room. Any one of us can become a rabbi. Great women became rabbis. And it's not about the position, not the title rabbi. But every person can contribute. In fact, every person is commanded to contribute to the great body of knowledge that we call Torah. You're not just having a conversation on Torah. Your contribution is part of Torah. Because God is not saying, here, take the raw material, throw it at them and say, just eat it. God is saying, develop it, prepare the dish. Every single one of us has a responsibility to take the textbook, the instruction manual of life, and to explore it and to study it and then to teach it. And we say it in the prayer right before the Shema. Lilmod, to learn.
Ulame.
Ulelamed,
Okay.
to teach. Lishmar, to preserve. Lasot, and to do. Ulekayim, and to carry on forever. That's what it is. That's the partnership right here. Right after the giving of the 10 Commandments, God says, don't you dare leave the Torah at Sinai. And say, oh, just what we heard at Sinai, and that's it. Tasim lifnehem, take the Torah and place it. Take the Torah from Sinai, develop it, clarify it, explain it. That is all part of Torah. And that is why it has always been the Jewish people's greatest legacy and the greatest responsibility. We don't reserve Torah learning for the scholar class, right? Any other society is defined by its business people and it's whatever. And there's a few people that become the professors, the college professors, whatever it is. That's not the way it works with Torah. We did not reserve Torah study for just the scholars. How many of you have ever read through even 2 paragraphs of the Constitution?
Only me.
Only the lawyers, right? I haven't. The Torah.
I have.
And Shudi, but I would say that even the lawyer, Jerry, you have read more times the length and breadth of Torah than you have read the Constitution, because it's not a profession. It's not a job description for a small group. It is our life and our legacy. It is our partnership with God. Every last one of us needs to study Torah. Every last one of us needs to contribute to Torah, because every last one of our contributions is part of Torah. And that's the call to action in this week's Torah portion. Do not be a passive receiver of the words of God from Sinai onto you. Take the Torah, make it your own, learn it, expound on it, teach it, live it.
It always reminds me of Lo B'Shamayim.
Yeah, that's the point. That's the point. God could have left.
Karov elecha hadavar.
Right. What does the Torah is not in heaven mean? What is this that Rabbi Yehoshua said to God? He said, God, if you wanted us just to follow verbatim what you said, if that was all we are meant to be, if our contribution is just executing your commands, then the Torah could have stayed in heaven and you could have broadcasted it down to earth. But that's not the way you did it, God. You took the Torah out of heaven and brought it down to earth. You took the Torah out of the jurisdiction of heaven and put it under our jurisdiction.
Torat Chaim, right? They call it Torat Chaim because it's evolved. It's not, it doesn't change, but we have to, translate it to our life.
Exactly right. Or more correctly, as I was saying, Netta, just to be able to kind of draw that clear difference between evolving the Torah and we are not evolved. We are not translating the Torah to our lives, but we're translating our lives to the Torah. Oh, there's something called a light bulb. Right. What does the Torah say about a light bulb on Shabbat? Not, oh, we have to translate Torah. We have to adapt Torah. We have to update Torah to deal with the light bulb. No, we have to ask, what does the Torah already say about the light bulb?
It's very much like the constitutional argument, the originalists versus the progressives.
Except that the progressives have a good argument with the Constitution, because at the end of the day, the Constitution is written by human beings. It's going to necessarily be limited and fallible.
Of course.
But that argument does not apply to the Torah. That argument does not, which is, by the way, why you see that the more kind of religious the Jew is, the more they are kind of conservative in terms of their outlook on the Constitution, just because they've already been steeped in that idea of respect for what already is. Are they entirely correct? Not necessarily, because again, the Constitution and the Torah are two completely different
Right.
paradigms. The Constitution was written by brilliant people, but by people. While the Torah was written by God, it does not need updating, it doesn't need adapting, but it does need development.
An analysis. And, yeah.
Because a seed has everything in it, but it needs to develop.
Right. You know, as you know, I've spent many years as a regulatory lawyer, and we had to look at the statute that we were working under in order to write the regulation about how you're supposed to read this and what you're supposed to do. But we had to go back for every word, for every comma, and justify it in the statute.
And that's exactly when you read any of the response of any rabbi, 90% of it, they will immediately, within the first few lines, pass the judgment. What do I do in this circumstance? The answer is you do this. But now let me explain to you why I know that that's what you should do. And they will cite all the way back to the Torah, all the way through the Talmud. There's a verse in the Torah that says this. The Talmud explains that verse to mean this. Then the later commentaries say that verdict of the Talmud would apply in this case is like this. Applying this, this, and this, and this, and this, all the way through. I can tell you that I am making an argument as to why this decision today is not based on my own intuition, not based on my own sense of what's moral or ethical, but this is what Moses would have said as well in this circumstance. And it's not because Moses is talking, it's because God is talking through Moses. That's a litmus test, as it were. You know, they say a joke, a fellow walks into a restaurant and he says, by the way, is this restaurant up to the proper kosher standard? And the fellow says, sure it is. You don't see the picture of Moses on the wall? And to which he says, sir, if there was a picture of you on the wall and Moses was serving this to me, then I would trust it. But
Yeah,
the bottom line is, go ahead.
I'm just so uncomfortable. I mean, who decides who the great rabbi is, or a good enough rabbi is to make these comments on the law? I have a law in one movement of Judaism that says, if you need to drive on Shabbos, drive on Shabbos. But I think that that's wrong. I think I'm sinning by doing that.
It never comes down to the rabbi. It comes down to the being able to cite it all the way back. And that was the point.
But that's what they're doing in the Shuvot.
That's what
They're giving you all of this logic from the beginning.
Oh, so if they can make
it
sure.
I just wonder.
No, but to your point, Paula, what do we have today as the most defining litmus test or whatever it is of the veracity of anything in science in it's called peer review, right? Peer review.
Right.
Oh, there's a peer review paper, right?
Right.
There is nothing that has been peer reviewed, nothing that has been peer reviewed like the Talmud. Every sage, you put something out there, you better be ready to defend it, not only against your colleagues of the time, but everybody who will come subsequently. And the Talmud has tens of thousands of works and hundreds of thousands and millions of people that looked at it and were not afraid to ask questions or to challenge. And that's the point. You're not taking the rabbi's word for it. No rabbi is able to present something in the Talmud and say, accept it because I said so. That was the point of Rabbi Yeshua. Even God, we're not going to take it just because you said so. Not once you've established that unless you can prove it. And now, again, you will have people that see it this way, and that's where majority comes in, et cetera, et cetera. But having said that, there are the rules, and the rules of what's considered proof and what's not considered proof. And that was also given, right? Rabbi Shmuel Omer b'shlosh esrei midot haTorah nidroshin. So there is a system here. And if your opinion passes muster, doesn't make a difference if you can be a child of 5. That could say something that you happened on something brilliant, and it actually holds up under the regimen of stress testing that we will give your idea. And then it's not about who said it; it's about what was said and whether it can be backed up. And if you can't back it up, what does the Talmud do when there are two opinions, but neither one of them can prove definitively that they are correct? Teku. Then rather than just come to an erroneous. What? But
Comes Mashiach, you'll be able to answer
Right.
the question.
in other words, what does that indicate? Rather than coming to some erroneous supposition, we'd rather leave it hanging. Right? That's what the word teku literally means. Leave it hanging, because we can't say for a fact, a matter of fact, that this is what the determination is in this circumstance. So Paula, your point is well taken, that a human being, because is prone to error, right? But God allows for that in His system, as long as we're trying our best to get it correct, and what the opinion and anybody who puts forward an opinion has to be able to back it up, and has to be able to allow that opinion to be challenged, attacked, and poked and prodded. In fact, the beauty of Jewish history, of the scholars of Jewish history, is that they didn't seek what we today have, which is to silence their opposition, right? To cancel anybody who dares present a diversity of opinion. Hillel deliberately sought out Shammai, because Hillel says, this is the way I see it, but Shammai, I know you see it 180 degrees. Your general character has you approach a subject from a completely different perspective. I adore that. I cherish that. I want to hear because I know that I am a human, and there's ways that it is very likely that I will make mistakes. You stop trusting a process when the process demands conformity and lack of challenge. But the beauty of Yiddishkeit is, what is the entire Talmud? Debate after debate after debate. And Hillel and Shammai never allowed themselves to become offended by the fact that the other one would dare not see it their way, because if they allowed it to get personal even once, then what would you see? The end of their debates. Hillel would at that point not look, would walk into the Beit Medrash, would see Shammai, and go completely in the other direction. And say,
One would be canceled.
right? But rather, Hillel sought out Shammai, and they debated on every page of the Talmud, right? Basically, I'm obviously exaggerating, because they deliberately sought each other out. They say, I want to test my opinion against yours, because our goal here is not to be right. Our goal here is to do what's right.
That's interesting.
And so I'd be happy to accept that I'm wrong if that brings greater clarity as to what we are supposed to in fact do. And that is key to the whole process. Almost what's more important than knowledge, Torah knowledge, is humbleness, right? Which also is taught by the idea that the fact that the Torah was given not on the tallest mountain, but on the most humble of mountains. Because more importantly than you being brilliant is your willingness to accept when you're wrong. And that happens throughout the Talmud. And again, perhaps is the message that God Himself is saying when He allowed for this whole charade of Him coming and arguing with Yeshua, right? Rabbi Yeshua wagging his finger, and God saying, oh, okay, you win. To make the point that at the end of the day, it's the truth that matters, and the process, the validity of the process, over whether I feel I'm right, etc. And that was the way of the case. By the way, Rabbi Eliezer, what happened? Did he ever? Did he then acquiesce to Yeshua? And the answer is he couldn't bring himself to acquiesce, because he felt like even God was on his side. So he felt that he was right, and he couldn't therefore, but he therefore accepted excommunication.
Exactly. That's what I thought you were going to say. Okay.
And he accepted it.
Right.
He says, I can't come to your side of this thing, but I realize that by doing so, I must exit the community.
Oh, I thought he just stepped down.
No.
Oh.
Because it wasn't, he says, I understand that it cannot be allowed a dissenting opinion that after we follow the rules and the majority has ruled, the law, the Torah law is everybody has to then follow that majority. And I cannot bring myself to do so, because I even have divine validation that I am correct. And so therefore I will continue to do what I'm doing, but it is wrong. I am wrong in doing it. And I hereby accept upon myself excommunication.
Oh my goodness.
So he knows he's wrong and he still, I mean, how can you say, okay, I'm wrong, but I'm doing it? It's
But because
almost,
because he had God, he's
because
on God's side.
because he understood it correctly. Right? We're saying that really God said Rabbi Eliezer's got it correct, but the majority of the rabbis couldn't see it, and because of that, that's the rules of the game.
You know, my
Rabbi
friend used
Eliezer
to say
saw
that,
it, and he couldn't let it go.
my friend used to say that's right, but ugly.
Right?
In other words,
Or it's
you're right.
It's
But
right from a position of integrity, but not right by the rules of the game. And because of that, he personally couldn't walk away from it, but he understood that he was wrong by still remaining a presence in the community and disobeying the majority. Because that's
but
the way
that's what
God.
the Orthodox do. No, the Orthodox do. We know that this is the way to do, even though the majority now are secular and maybe don't.
No,
So
but
the Orthodox says, we know that this is the right way, and we live in the way that we believe that this is the right.
so the answer is because not the majority. We're not just saying a majority of people. It's not a democratic vote. It's the majority of those that are using the standards of Torah of Torah interpretation. If those all the rabbis, conservative reform, whatever it is, would be making arguments based on the Torah true value, the Torah true rules, then that would be a different story. But they themselves are saying that we're not sticking to the original rules. We're creating up our own. That's what they call the platforms, right? The Pittsburgh platform, the Philadelphia platform. We're creating, there's no orthodox platforms. Platforms mean we're creating our own platform. There's one platform. The Orthodox follow the Sinai platform. Period. And that's the key difference. That is the key difference, Netta. That's the point. The majority of rabbis that follow the platform, that's the rule. Now,
So that's the reason we have a lot of sectors. We have the Bell, we have the Baslev, we have Chabad. So that's the same because
yes,
they go
yes,
coming up from the
because
same rules.
all those are only differences in minhag. Or for example, Sephardi and Ashkenazi, you see, that's the thing though, because the Ashkenazi rabbi looking at a Sephardi rabbi, but if both are Orthodox, respect that even though I don't see it your way, I see that you are following tradition all the way up.
right.
I see that you are following a set of rules all the way up. And that was the ability of Rav Moshe Isserlis, the Ashkenazi, who saw halacha differently than Rav Yosef Karo, to then collaborate with Rav Yosef Karo in the Shulchan Aruch. So here's the Ashkenazi and here's the Sephardi, because each one is following the traditions as they have it passed down. So somewhere along the way we lost which in these two directions is the definitive, but at least we can march it all the way back up. While the reform is right there in the word. What does reform mean?
We're changing. They reformed it.
We're reforming the platform.
Well, what about the word reconstruction? That's even more, think about it.
Right. And conservative, where's the term conservative come from? Conservative vis-a-vis reform.
Preserve, conserve it.
But vis-a-vis what?
But they choose what to do. They don't.
No, but I'm saying,
Don't ask me that question. I'm not going to give you a pretty answer.
But I'm saying, but even by their own definition, they are conservative as a vis-a-vis what? Vis-a-vis the Orthodox?
No.
No, they are conservative vis-a-vis reform.
The reform.
So they are branching off of that general approach, which says that Torah needs to be reformed. We're just going to take a more conservative approach. That's what they are. Otherwise,
conservative to the reform.
They are not conservative vis-a-vis Orthodox. They are branching off not of Orthodoxy. They are a branch off of reform, and that's what it was. That's what it is. This is a matter of historical fact. You don't have to take my word for it.
Right.
The bottom line is, therefore, the legitimacy of those premises doesn't begin, because.
And the Reconstructionist was a branch off of conservative.
I
happen to know.
But either way, the point being that the role of mankind in Torah is very real. It's very real, but it's not, as we said, again, it's not to adapt, it's not to reform, it's to develop God's word. It is to take the textbook and explain it, but not to update it, to explain it, to adapt it, yes, but not to update it. And so, and where do we have the license to do that? Eila Mishpatim asher tasim lifneihem. God makes this very clear at the beginning of this parsha, right after, immediately following the great advent of the giving of the Torah. God says, and here is your responsibility. Don't just command it from the top of the mountain, bring it in ready to eat format to the people. All right, everybody?
Thank you, Rabbi. Amazing
Thank you,
class.
Rabbi. Have a great
Thank
Shabbos.
you,
I hope
Rabbi.
very much.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat
Shabbat
shalom.
shalom,
God,
everybody.
a food for thoughts.
Yes.
Food for thoughts.
There you go. That's exactly what all Torah is, food for thought. And the job of the rabbi is, of all Torah teachers, is to prepare it.
And make sure it's
Okay,
Cook up
you
some
gave us
food
a
for
good,
thought.
good meal. Thank you very
Consumable.
much and Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat shalom, everybody.
Shabbat
Right.
shalom.
Right.